Many of us love coffee, but some of our bodies can't tolerate the caffeine, or we don't care to have the caffeine, and so we look for decaffeinated options. In the past, decaffeinated coffee has had a bad rap, and I'm talking years ago, but especially in the specialty market in these most recent years, there are some gems when it comes to decaffeinated coffee. So today we're going to talk about roasting decaf coffee because there are some differences and there are some things you need to know. So stick around. All right, welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be talking about roasting decaffeinated coffee. There are several differences in the way that we should roast decaf coffee, or things that we should be aware of, and I'm going to hit each of those in just a second. But first, I want to deal with the elephant in the room, and that is the question, is decaf coffee any good when it comes to specialty coffee? The answer is there's some excellent decaffeinated coffee that is out in the specialty market, but you have to look carefully for it and you have to understand what it is you're looking for. The purpose of this video isn't necessarily to outline the differences between one decaffeinated process over another. I will tell you that it's important for you to do some research, and I've included some links in the description to the different decaffeinated processes and what you need to know, so that when you go and purchase green coffee to roast at home, specialty coffee, you need to look very carefully at the decaffeination process so that you can understand how that may or may not influence your coffee flavor. As far as health goes, there aren't any decaffeinated processes currently used in the market today that may be considered banned or hazardous to your health. So you should check those out. So look at the links in the description, and let's talk about the decaffeination process in a very general sense and how that influences the coffee bean, so that we can then talk about how we should roast it differently, or what we can expect to happen differently to our roast. All right, after coffee is harvested and it is processed at the mill, whether it's a dried processed coffee or whether it's a washed coffee, whatever the process is, you can decaffeinate coffee. After it is gone through that process, the parchment has been removed, and the coffee is then transported to a decaffeination facility. And there's two extra steps that take place to our coffee before we receive it to roast. And that is that the coffee is rehydrated, and the decaffeination process is done at that time, and then it is dehydrated. Those are the two steps. So our coffee, when it goes through this process, the cellular structure of the coffee is impacted, and the moisture that is left in the bean, all beans have moisture when we receive them to roast, is more susceptible or more sensitive to heat. And that's because the cellular structure of the bean has been influenced by or through the decaffeination process, and so we have a less dense bean that we are going to be roasting. There are several things that you need to be aware of when roasting decaffeinated coffee, and we're going to get to those tips in just a second. But I want to thank you guys for joining me, and for those who are enjoying this video or have been enjoying the videos on my channel, I would encourage you to please subscribe. That helps me out. I'd appreciate that. Hit the notification bell as I regularly upload new videos devoted to home coffee roasters. All right, and now for the 3 tips for roasting decaffeinated coffee. The first tip is that you should use the same profile for your decaf as you would for your regular coffee. If it's a dry process Ethiopian, you would use the same profile as you with this decaf Ethiopian dry process coffee as you would with the washed. Now, we're going to get to some details about that, but what I mean by the profile is the overall profile, the total length of your roast time, the percentages in each of your phases, so the dry phase, the browning phase, and the development phase. You can use the same profile. That's a good thing. You can honestly have a decaffeinated coffee that is fruity, that it has caramel notes, that has berry notes, all of the different flavor notes that you're trying to attempt to roast. If that's your style of roasting, you can do the same thing with a decaffeinated coffee, the only difference being that the caffeine is removed from it. I know that there are some differences. There are some subtle flavor differences with decaffeinated coffee, and depending upon the decaffeination process, that can influence it more than others. But let's just leave that aspect out of it. As far as the origin and the roasting process goes, that's what I'm referring to. So use the same profile as you would with any other coffee. You'll have some great success when it comes to roasting decaf coffee, and you'll experience all the wonderful flavors that you're hoping you will. And again, I've mentioned this in some of my other videos, I've got a playlist up here in the corner for coffee roasting essentials that is so important when it comes to understanding how to roast coffee to get all of these great flavors. The playlist involves the drying phase, the browning phase, the development phase, and talks about the overall profile in my 3 tips for new home coffee roasters video. So that playlist is up here. You should definitely check that out. Speaking of playlists, I reorganized my playlists a few weeks ago, and so it's when you add new videos over time, you kind of have to resort and reorganize your playlists, and that's what I did. So check those out. I've got them organized much better now, and it should be easier to kind of dig through some of the topics or themes that you're interested in. The second tip for roasting decaffeinated coffee is that we need to be very careful of the drying phase, because decaffeinated coffee is very sensitive, more sensitive to heat than a coffee that has not been decaffeinated. So we need to be very careful of that. As I had mentioned, the decaffeinated process changes the cellular structure of the bean, and so we have a lower density bean. This is important for us to know because, as I had mentioned, we want to use the same profile that we would for a caffeinated coffee, but we need to be aware that if we are using a lot of heat in the beginning, we could have roasting defects, and we may have our dry phase go much quicker with a decaffeinated coffee. So we need to be very careful with our heat management during the dry phase. So what that might look like is this. Let's say that we have a 5-minute dry phase that we want. 4.5 minutes for a dry process, 5 minutes for a wash process. Let's just say that that's the scenario. You can do that with a decaffeinated coffee, but you may have to tweak your charge temperature and your length of soak if you're soaking your beans, and how much energy you're applying to be able to reach those times during the dry phase. This is a very important point because it's kind of a delicate balance. When you make changes to your roasting temperatures, it's going to have an influence on your drying phase time. If you lower your charge temperature, it's going to take longer to dry the coffee, right? So you may have a lower charge temperature but a shorter soak. So let's just say that you have your normal roasting is 380 degree charge temperature and a 1-minute soak. You may do a 370 charge temperature with the decaf and have no soak and have a slightly lower energy setting during your dry phase, and at least for the first couple of minutes, and then you can start to build the heat up. You just don't want to apply all that heat all at one time to the bean. And then you need to carefully monitor your progress through the dry phase. So if your target is a 5-minute dry and you're watching this and you see, wow, you're noticing that this is going to dry a lot quicker, you need to back off your heat, slow it down. Because just like in my video that's up here in the playlist, why the dry phase is so important, if you have so much energy built up in those beans because they're a lower density, you're going to hit dry end and you're going to fly through the middle phase, the browning phase, and you're not going to get the results that you want. You're going to have a coffee that doesn't have all the flavors. It might be more tart. There's just a lot of bad things that can happen if your dry phase is too quick or too hot when you come out of the dry phase and then move into that next phase. So be very careful of your heat management. Make the adjustments necessary when roasting the decaf. All right, and then the third point, the third tip that is so important for decaffeinated coffee, and that is the color. It's very obvious when we look at the color before we even roast the beans that there's a difference. They're a shade darker. Decaf coffee is a shade darker, or even more so, than regular washed or dried processed coffees. You put them in the roaster, you go through the dry phase. It's very difficult to be able to know when to call the dry phase a dry end. And so what do? What we can't do is rely on color. That's my third point. You can't rely on color. You have to rely on smell and also your familiarity with the profile that you're roasting. So if you're used to roasting within a certain time frame period, watch the beans, smell them carefully, because as soon as the grassy smell goes away and the doughy smell goes away and it starts to get a little sweet, it starts to get a little more like baked goods, you know you've hit dry. So you're going to have to rely on that. I did a video on smell, color and smell, so that you can kind of know what's happening in the roast. But the smell is so important with decaffeinated coffee. Pay attention to that while you're roasting. The same thing happens not only at dry end when you're trying to call green to yellow, but also when it comes time to drop the coffee. You can't rely on the normal color of the beans. They look different. They look darker than they really are. And so you need to be very aware of the timing of first crack and the length of time after that in your development to determine when to drop. So smell and use your times to monitor your development phase so you know exactly when to drop the coffee. When we roast coffee here, decaffeinated coffee here, it seems like we're usually roasting it maybe 1 degree or 2 degrees further than a regular washed or regular decaffeinated coffee. And I'm not sure why. It just seems to have a better overall balance and flavor profile. A lot of the coffees we're dealing with are Central American decaf coffees that we roast here in the lab. And I would encourage you to try different decaffeinated coffees. Be aware of the profile that you would want to use with this based on its origin, but just be very, very careful that you can't rely on color to be able to get you through and know when your phases have ended and when you want to drop the coffee. All right, everyone, decaf coffee is not like it used to be in the old days. There's none of this going on when it comes to decaf coffee. There's some great decafs out there, and a lot of these specialty roasteries are trying to highlight a good decaf coffee. And there's some great choices out there. And so I would encourage you, if you really want to have more coffee during the day or that afternoon cup or even a cup at night, but you're afraid or you don't want to be bothered with the caffeine if it keeps you up, I would encourage you to try and roast some decaf coffee. Just be very careful. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, look at the descriptions of the decaf process and determine what you think is the best process for you. I'll have links about a couple of the different processes, and just look for those in the descriptions of the greens that you buy from whatever source you're buying from. Please leave your comments. Do you roast decaf coffee? Share your experiences with decaf with me. I'd be interested to hear that. Also, if you've had some great success with the decaf, if there's your favorite, tell me which type of decaffeinated coffee, the origin, the name of the farm, and all of that. I would like to be able to hear that and check that out myself. I have a very interesting coffee that I'm going to be talking with you about soon. Somebody suggested for me to check this out, and it's totally different than anything that I've roasted before. It's kind of crazy, and I'm going to have that in an upcoming video, so look for that. And I've got plenty of more great content coming, and I hope this video has been helpful. Hit the like button if it has. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you guys have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.